specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Rev Don. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Rev Don, we can talk directly. If you type your question or comment on whatever platform you happen to be watching on, it will show up here in my chat room, and we can talk directly. And I want to welcome everyone. I hope you're having a lovely Thursday. Today, my subject is how to write a book. Yesterday, we talked about my newest book, which is Reverend Don's Book of Astrology. And that has become available at CorellianPublishing.com. We've sold the first few pre-orders already. The ETA is basically the spring equinox. I think we said March 21st. It'll be around that time. The book is currently being written. Hello to Renee in the chat room. Hello to Calvin in the chat room. It's good to see you both. Today I thought maybe I'd talk a little bit about how to write a book. You know, I've known a lot of people who wanted to write a book or books and had more or less success in doing so. And having written now quite a number of them, there are a few things that I think I have to say to it. Now, yesterday I mentioned one of the best pieces of advice I've received, which came from Sir Edward, saying that it's important to remember your audience when you're writing. This is vitally important in whatever you may be writing. You don't want to use, without explanation, terms they're not going to get. That doesn't mean that you want to, quote, dumb your work down, end quote. It means that you want to make sure you explain anything that needs explaining before you start using it. If you go through, for example, the Corellian Wicca lessons, there's lots of use of metaphysical terms in there, but they're explained before they're used so that people understand what they're reading. This is a very important part of writing. And it goes in more than one direction because it does depend on who your audience is. So the very first thing you need to consider, if you think you would write, that you think that you would like to write a book, the first thing you need to consider is who you're writing it for. And that can be a question with a number of different answers. And whatever your answer to that question is will have something to do with how you write that book. In some cases, it may have to do with how you structure it. In some cases, it will have to do with the way you approach things like vocabulary. Obviously, the clearest example is if you're writing a book aimed at children, you'll want to write it very differently than if you are writing a book aimed at academia. But there are many, many other ways in which the audience makes a difference. Hello to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you. So your first thought on the subject of writing a book is, who are you writing it for? And in some cases, the answer to that might be that you're writing it for yourself. But you know, this too involves particular considerations. If you're writing it for yourself, why are you doing so? And is it going to do what you hope it will do? If you're writing it for a particular audience, are you aiming it to what they can understand, and will it have the effect you hope it will have? There's not a lot of point in writing a book that no one's going to read. There's not a lot of point in writing a book if people aren't going to understand it. There's a limited point in writing a book that you think people will not accept. But sometimes, even if you know people aren't going to accept a certain point of view, it may still need to be said. So I'm not going to consider that a disqualifying situation, but it is something you may wish to consider. And hello to Eve in the chat room. It's good to see you, Eve. These are all some of the things that you want to consider in writing your book. Another piece of advice that Sir Edward once gave me that was also one of the most important pieces of advice I've ever received is that it's not a book until the last page is finished. And um, if you have half a book sitting somewhere, you have not written a book. You've written half a book. Um, Finishing the project is vitally important. If you don't finish it, why did you even start it? It's very important to be prepared to finish it out till the end. And it's not uncommon when writing a book that you're going to come to a point that it becomes a little more difficult than it was when you started, and you have to continue going. Um, you can take a little time aside, but you must come back to it if you wish for it to come into existence. I can't think of much sadder than having a half dozen unfinished books at the end of one's life that will never see the light of day. Now, there are, of course, famous authors who left unfinished books that someone else finished for them that did see the light of day. But that's rather uncommon when all is said and done. And plus, who knows if the finished version is what they really would have wanted it to be. Um, and sometimes, if you are already an accomplished author and you leave an unfinished work, it can become a legend in its own right, like the Mystery of Edwin Drood, um, which has given rise to all sorts of creativity after the death of its author. But generally speaking, unfinished manuscripts just get thrown out somewhere. So you want to have that resolve when you start the first page that you are going to finish the last page. Though it may be that you may change drastically what you intend during that period. I have written, well, I should say I've published one novel during my lifetime. I've actually written two, and the second one was published. And about halfway through, I basically threw out the manuscript and started over again, and much preferred the second version. But I finished it. Um, to be honest, I could probably use another rewrite because novels have not really been my thing, but I wrote it and I published it. Again, finishing the last page is the most important page in the work because it's easy to do the first page. It takes a lot of more effort to get to the last page. Another very important consideration is how are you going to publish it? Are you planning to send it to a publishing house? Or are you planning to self-publish? Today, self-publishing is very easy and has drastically changed the literary landscape. And um, I believe I've heard it said that of most books published in the United States, most sell less than 1,000 copies. It's rare books that do better than that. So understand that when you begin. Understand that even if you go to a publishing house, you're still going to have to promote the book yourself. Unless it's one of the really major publishing houses um, and you're relatively well established. If you watched things like Murder, She Wrote years ago and watched the publishing house promoting Jessica Fletcher's books, it's because she'd had so many well-selling books before that they were willing to do that, and because she had a major publisher. Most publishers not only won't do that, they can't. They don't have the budget for it. What a publishing house can do, which is less important now than it was, is get you out in a wider distribution. But if you have a means to publicize your own books, you don't really need that. And that's about the only thing they're going to do. They will provide you with editors. But now in the age of AI, you can get an AI editor very easily who will do just as well, for the most part, as anything but a truly expert human editor. Now, if you're lucky enough to have an expert human editor, they can advise you on things like style and so forth. Um, but I think that this is a position which is largely becoming part of the past. So these are all the things that you have to consider from a practical point of view before you even start writing a book. Other things you need to consider: do you have anything to say? Why do you want to write a book? I was saying, I believe just yesterday, that I had made a vow to myself that I would never write a book unless I had something original to say. I wasn't just going to be a clone of other books out there. And I've tried to stick with that, and I think that I have. Um, Part of that is because I've read so many books, and I know that the ones that I like are the ones that have something original to say. And part of it is just that I know how much time goes into writing a book. And if you don't have something original to say, it's an awful lot of time to spend. And so for me, having something original to say is very important. Sometimes there may be a particular point that I feel needs to be made um, that can only really be answered in that sort of longer format. You may have other reasons that you would like to write a book, but you should be clear on what they are. Um, One reason that has been effective with me is people asking me to write more books. I've found people enjoy my writing and want more of it. And still within that context of wanting to confine myself to original things that I can say, I have found that people's desire for my writing um, has given me the impetus to continue writing. Not nearly at the level some people might have desired, but still at some pace. And to some extent, all of these same considerations come into things like video, like what I'm doing right now. Why do this? Um, Many of the same reasons are part of why I continue doing video offerings. Um, I think that it's always important to bring an originality to what you're doing, to bring good and useful information. And, sometimes that original thing to say isn't entirely original, but it's good and useful information that might not be readily available. And that, too, in its own way, is an original message to be given. When I look back on Reverend Don's vlog that I did for a solid decade, many of the subjects that I spoke on were perfectly typical metaphysical subjects, but they were questions that people were not finding their answers to. And I tried to get those answers for them, and I tried to get them in impartial ways. One of the things that I considered very important about the vlog was that one, I would answer almost any question, even ones that some people would have dismissed as foolish. And I tried to take the attitude that there were no foolish questions, and I tried to answer them either not only from my own viewpoint, but from as many viewpoints as I could speak to. Or if I found I did need to answer it more from my own viewpoint, I made that very clear. Um, but I was very proud of the offering of the vlog, and the vlog is now available in book form as well, Reverend Don's Books of Questions. Currently, 3 out of 4 volumes have been published. And they deal with the questions from the vlog because, again, it was something original to say in the form of a book. And good information to be imparting. Now, let us say that you've answered your question why you want to write a book. You've answered your question who your audience is. You have an idea of how you're going to publish it. How do you actually set about doing it? And I have to say first, there's no one answer that's going to fit everyone because, as in everything else, people are individual. Not everyone is going to write exactly the same way. But speaking from my own point of view, it's generally helpful to start with your outline. Even if you're not certain that you're going to follow the exact outline you start with, it's a good place to start and to work out the points that you want to hit before you've actually started writing. So, for example, with the recent Book of the Dead, I created my outline before I ever started writing the book. And that outline had the major headings of different subjects and also the different points within those subjects I really wanted to touch on. When I started writing, many other things came out that expanded on that outline. But the fact that it was there gave me the focus to write it relatively quickly. So I highly recommend starting with the outline. Now, in the case of my novel, Death at the Horizon of Joy, I started with an outline there as well. Um, and I found that it deviated greatly from my original outline. Part of that was intentional, part of it just happened. And I'll tell you, if you're writing a fiction story, as a novel, for example, you may find that the characters will tell you what they need to happen, and it may not be what you quite intended. When I was writing Death on the Horizon of Joy, as I was plotting out the characters, and I spent a lot of time plotting the characters, one of the things I did is I considered Gilligan's Island. And as you undoubtedly know, Gilligan's Island was based on the seven deadly sins of Christian mythology. And each of the seven castaways represented one of those um, behaviors. The skipper was wrath, Gilligan was sloth, Ginger was lust, Marianne was envy, Lovey Howell was gluttony, um, the professor was pride, and Mr. Howell was greed. And if you look at their characters, you can see that very clearly. Notwithstanding that they became very sympathetic characters despite their flaws. But it was an interesting way of organizing their characteristics. So I applied that also to the characters I was developing. And then I wrote them. And I found that they took very different directions than what I had intended, and came out very differently than I had intended. But it did help me to organize my thoughts. Some people like the idea of having a certain number of hours to write every day. I think that's probably very constructive if your day allows for it. Um, or maybe I should say a certain number of hours to allow to the project every day. And in particular, those people who write large numbers of books, I think tend to do it that way, with time set aside every day to work on the things that they're doing. And hello to Brian in the chat room. Hello to Magical Mermaid in the chat room. It's good to see you both. Um, but as I say, I would start with the outline, but I would regard the outline as a guideline, and do not necessarily expect to stick too close to it. I would say do set a time to work on your project on a regular basis, maybe every day, maybe every other day, but that will keep you going. And I find for myself that Brian says, I love outlines and forward planning of a project, as you know. Yes. And it can be very useful. Now, of course, it depends on the work that you're writing too. But even something like the Omnibus, which is a collection of metaphysical poetry and artwork, it's organized in a certain way that required an outline. And I think that any literary project will require that outline. Generally speaking, my advice is that you want to remember you're going to have to do more than one draft. And some people will say, finish the whole thing and then go back and rework it. I find for myself, that is not what I do. I'll finish a section and then sometimes go back and rework it. And sometimes having written as much as I've written, I don't necessarily find that second step necessary. It all depends. But usually I will certainly go through it more than one time. I like to read it aloud to see how it flows. Um, and I think it's very important to consider how it flows. People have told me when they read my books, they can hear my voice if they've been familiar with my videos. And this is an important point to bear in mind, that the voice of your writing is an important thing. You want to have your own voice. And I was talking the other day about not liking the direction that many computerized grammar programs are trying to point people toward using the most concise language possible. That's called eliminating your voice. Um, it's fine for business writing. It might be fine for academic writing. It's not good for creative writing. Um, you want to have a distinct voice. And hello to Jai Rajput, who says, "Hello, Professor Don. It's good to see you, Jai." Um, it is important, I think, to be mindful of your voice and not allow it to be cut out. Now, sometimes um, you want to be careful that you're using your actual voice. Um, and I know in my case, when I was published through Llewellyn, a lot of things that were very typical wordplay for me, they did not like, because I have a tendency to use arcane forms. And they may very well have been right, that people would have had some difficulty understanding some of those. Um, I tend to figure people will catch on, but that's me. I also am known for things like capitalizing in an unusual fashion. I capitalize more like a speaker of German than a speaker of English. And I tend to capitalize the words I really want to call attention to. And so in that sense, I capitalize on a more individual level. And I know that for some people that's problematic for them, for others it's not. I think it has to do, that particular choice on my part, has to do with the very eclectic background that I have in my own reading, which did involve those older manuscripts that used different styles of capitalization. But it also was helpful for calling my attention to things. And I realize now that I'm somewhere in the neurodivergent range, and the eccentricities of my writing have something to do with that. And again, I tend to figure that people will catch on. Um, I haven't really had anyone tell me they couldn't read my writing because there's a capital where they didn't expect it. But if you've read my books and that did stop you from being able to finish, let me know. It's something that would be useful. Other things that you should consider. The hardest part of writing a book is finishing, sticking with it. Life gets in the way oh so very easily. And you have to realize this is a major commitment when you start out to do it. The more you do, the easier it's going to get for the most part. But you'll read about people who took years and years and years to finish a book. And some of my writing has taken just that long, and others not, depending what it is. The second degree is famous for being cursed, because at any time anything is done to it, it takes forever. Whereas the first and third degree did not. Um, Third degree went by like nothing. Um, the Book of the Dead came together very quickly. Um, Death on the Horizon of Joy took 10 years, although at least 3 or 4 of those years I'd stepped away from the project before coming back to it. There are other projects I have. Well, the Tarot of Hecate, which, although not exactly a book, is basically the same concept. A creative project involving most of the same considerations, took over 30 years, but that's because for about 20 of those years, it was not being worked with. It had been a project that was done in the 1980s that almost got published, and only many years later did we come back to it when circumstances had changed and publishing it was much easier. But generally speaking, on the subject of just writing a book, it's a major time commitment, and you must be cognizant of that when you begin. Um, and there may be times when you feel, for example, writer's block, which may hold you back for a while. And what do you do if you have writer's block? Well, sometimes it's best to just step back and let it work its way through. Or you might want to use techniques of shadow work to work on it. But writer's block can stop you from working on a particular project because the creativity simply will not come. But the other thing you have to bear in mind, particularly if you want to be a writer for a living, is that although it's a creative process, you still have to work with it even when you don't feel creative. It's also a technical process. And maybe you can't do the creative part on a certain day. You work on the technical parts on that day. But the primary point is to finish the project. Um, for some people, I think, now I was talking about the fact that I tend to revise as I go. I think others do better to finish the first draft entirely and then revise it, so that they will have something finished that they can feel strong about. Knowing at this point that I'm going to finish it, I can take the time to revise it as I write it. As I say, I've always had the habit of reading aloud what I've written to make sure it flows. Um, this is especially true, but not exclusively true, in things like the mini spells that show up in the omnibus, in Death on the Horizon of Joy, etc., where I really wanted to have the cadence of spoken language. But even in the more technical things I've written, I want to make sure that the wording and the phraseology is mellifluous and flows easily from the page into the brain. And um, I think that's very important. However, it's also important to remember that your individual style may be very different from mine. And if you look at all the great authors of humanity, they come in all kinds of different styles. Um, so far be it for me to say that one is the only desirable one. So these are my basic pieces of advice on writing a book. And I hope you found them helpful. And thank you all for joining me. I loved spending this time with you. I love talking with you. I love all of you. And I see that we've come to the end of our half hour, so I will see you tomorrow. And let us close with our prayer, as we always do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives. And we pray that you will continue to come forward with us as we go forward into the future, and that you will help us to express ourselves in the world, whether through writing or through other means. Help us to bring our message into the world and to find a receptive audience for it. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks, and knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and I will see you tomorrow, and may you be blessed now and always.